This is, by far, one of the best games ever made. Hello everyone, welcome to my Last of Us Remastered, grounded difficulty. No damage, no crafting, no upgrades, no safes, no Shiv doors, no training manuals walkthrough. And that is quite a lot of restrictions, but it wasn't too bad in the long run. And this is the entirety of Boston, including the quarantine zone and also the outskirts area. And I've trimmed out a lot of the cutscenes, I've trimmed out a lot of the slower moments. If you would like to see those moments, I do have a no commentary version of this walkthrough on my channel. And for this particular walkthrough, I will be including only the moments where you're picking up ammunition, you're under threat, and that's it. And it's very interesting that I'm doing this walkthrough after doing my walkthrough of The Last of Us Part 2, so there is definitely going to be a lot of interesting tangents to go on when I'm comparing this game to the second Last of Us. But either way, both games are phenomenal. This whole entire series is a masterpiece, and I am so glad to be doing this walkthrough right now. But for that previous encounter with the infected, you have to tilt the analog lightly, because for some reason, those runners can actually hear you even when you're crouched, which is why you gotta move very slowly. And that section's done, and now we're on this section with the humans. So compared to the way the humans fought in the second Last of Us, these guys aren't so much of a problem. And you'll notice that I bob out of cover for a little bit, and then I go back into cover. I do that because the humans, while they're in cover, they immediately try to shoot you whenever you bob out of cover, and you can use that to your advantage in order to place your reticle in the right position where you can get free headshots, and also as a way of forcing the humans out of cover in order to try to kill them. And that encounter's done. So, grounded difficulty was not in the second Last of Us, so that's definitely the first thing I should talk about. Grounded difficulty is one of my favorite difficulty modes of this game, and the things you need to bear in mind with grounded difficulty is the enemies are a lot more damaging on this difficulty compared to survivor difficulty. And you'll notice that I have no HUD. That is not something I've turned off. It's something that the difficulty has turned off. So on a casual playthrough, you have no way of knowing how much health you currently have, and also whether your guns are fully filled or not. But you're going to be constantly reloading, so that part of it isn't so much of a big deal. And the health part of it isn't so much of a big deal if you're going for no damage. But I will say, though, there are times on this game where Joel does animations that make it seem like he's taking damage when he actually hasn't. And it can be very hard at times to understand if you've taken damage or not when the game disables your HUD. So there are ways of understanding this, and there are different ways of healing on this game. You have the medkits, and if Joel starts doing the animation where he's trying to wrap his arm, it means he's taking damage. If you get any moments where you pick up food, it means he's taking damage. So those can be very effective ways of knowing whether you've taken damage or not on grounded difficulty. I don't have the luxury of having a medkit in my inventory since I'm not going to be crafting for this walkthrough, and the only medkits I ever use are the ones that the game tutorializes. But even though I didn't have a medkit in my inventory, it was always easy to tell if I'd taken damage or not thanks to the damage indicators. Although, there are moments where you take damage but you don't see any damage indicators, and this is the main case with bloaters. Because when bloaters throw their mycotoxic sacks at you, there are times where Joel just flinches when the mycotoxic sack hits the ground, and it makes it seem like he's taking damage when in actuality he's just flinched from it, like as if he was just startled by it. But then he does the same animation for when he takes damage, and it can be very confusing at times. And then there are a couple of moments on this game where you take mandatory damage. One part of the game that really confused me a lot when it came to mandatory damage was Jackson, because there's an encounter that begins with a guy throwing a Molotov, and it forces you off your horse, and it actually does damage to you. I didn't actually know this did damage to me, and I think the only reason I didn't know is because I've never really done this game without taking any damage, because I've always just kind of gone with the flow of the game. But for this walkthrough, I'm not going to be taking any damage. So when I got to that moment, and I took damage, and I picked up food in that area, I was so confused, and because of that confusion, I ended up restarting the chapter when I didn't even need to do so. So that was very unfortunate, but don't try to get confused by those moments. Know that they're there, and just heal yourself when you can. Just because there are mandatory damage moments doesn't mean the game is automatically bad. I'm not like those kind of individuals who voice some of the most subjective statements ever, and there's nothing objectively bad whatsoever with such sections. Just don't take any damage for the other sections. Simple as that. And that's exactly what I did in this walkthrough. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you to get through this game on grounded difficulty without any trouble whatsoever. Now, the next thing that grounded difficulty does, which is something that I really love, and it's something that not a lot of games do, it increases your weapon damage. So your weapons do a lot more damage at the cost of enemies killing you very quickly. There are times where you can get one shot by the enemies if they hit you in the head, and that's happened to me several times. It's something you've got to be very careful of when it comes to the enemies, but the increased weapon damage on your weapons is incredible. Weapons that were previously useless on the other difficulties have been made better on this difficulty, and the weapons that really benefit from this parameter are the pistols. The 9mm pistol can two-shot humans, and it takes 3 shots to kill infected. And then the revolver is one of the most powerful weapons on this game. It 2-shots infected, and it 1-shots humans. I save the revolver a lot throughout this whole entire game, and I only ever use the revolver for very particular situations where I need it. And I normally use other weapons for such situations, but on this walkthrough, because I'm not going to be able to pick up a lot of ammo, and because I'm not investing in upgrades, I need the revolver for other situations, and you can get a lot of revolver ammo on this game. So the fact that they went in there, and they made these weapons so much more reliable, is amazing, and it's something that really benefits the survival horror aspect of this game. They give you less ammunition on grounded difficulty, but your weapons do so much more damage, and it makes the weapons feel like they matter, and that's exactly what weapons should feel like in a survival horror game. Weapons in survival horror games should always take skill to use, and you should be rewarded for using them properly, and that's exactly what you get in this game, which is amazing. I never thought Naughty Dog would ever do something clever like this with a difficulty, and it's one of the main reasons why I was disappointed that grounded difficulty didn't return in the second Last of Us, and I had to deal with very underpowered weapons, and it was just such a jarring experience for me. And I'm not saying it took away from the experience, I still enjoyed The Last of Us Part 2 a lot, but I would have been much happier if the weapons in the second Last of Us felt just as powerful as the weapons on the first Last of Us on grounded difficulty. Because when you're firing weapons like the sniper rifle or the bow and arrow on the second Last of Us and it doesn't one-shot kill enemies, it just doesn't feel right. When you think of such weapons, you think of just how powerful they are. How many sniper rifles have you used in games, and it's always one-shot killed enemies? Or when it comes to bow and arrows, like, bow and arrows are very large projectiles that are very sharp. And it makes total sense for such weapons to one-shot kill enemies. And I just like the logic in that, but the fact that they didn't bring that back in the second Last of Us was very disappointing. And when it came to the stealth encounters, for instance, on the second Last of Us, you just couldn't reliably use the bow and arrow because the game was so strict on your headshots. You could not reliably use the bow and arrow to just take down enemies. The only other way to make sure that the enemies wouldn't be able to detect you so quickly after being shot by the first arrow is to shoot them once in the leg and then finish them up, because when they get shot in the leg, they get put into a flinch animation that will prevent them from alerting the other enemies. And it just felt like a very clunky process, and it made the bow and arrow very unreliable on that game. And I never really used the sniper rifle that much in the second Last of Us, and I mainly used other weapons for that, and it just kind of destroys any incentive to use the weapons on that game, and they just kind of become throwaway weapons at that point. But at least the bow and arrow wasn't so much of a throwaway weapon compared to the rifle, because the bow and arrow had one redeeming quality in that it could one-shot kill helmeted enemies, but the rifle didn't really have any redeeming qualities on that game. And it's the same with the revolver. The revolver on the second Last of Us just wasn't really that good, and the only reason you'd ever want to use the pistols on the second Last of Us was to put enemies into a flinch animation that you could punish. And I guess that's one quality I really like about the second Last of Us compared to the first Last of Us, because you can't really punish that many flinch animations in the first Last of Us. The second Last of Us gave you a lot more flinch animations to punish because it took way more influences from Resident Evil 4. And that's why the guns on the second Last of Us were definitely needed, because the enemies were pretty aggressive on the second Last of Us compared to the first Last of Us. The first Last of Us, the enemies are pretty passive. I mean, the runners on this game are still pretty fast, and the infected are still pretty dangerous, but the humans, because of how simple their animations are, they're a lot more predictable in what they do, and they don't tend to do a lot of complex movements like they can in the second Last of Us. And that was one of the main reasons why the humans on that game were very dangerous to fight. And on that note, I definitely find that the first Last of Us is a significantly easier game compared to the second Last of Us, because of the fact that everything is just more simple in its design. You know, this was Naughty Dog's very first time trying out a game like this, and you can definitely see some of the simple design choices in play, and because of the simple design choices in play, it makes this game a lot easier, and that's why I'm not doing a lot of commentary for all of those encounters I just did. It's because they're very easy to do, and one of the simple designs that they've gone for with the stealth on this game is the simple animations that the enemies do. You know, the enemies on this game, they always go straight. They don't do any kind of turning animations like they can in the second Last of Us, and I definitely feel like that is something that the first Last of Us does better than the second Last of Us, because the turning animations in the second Last of Us were very bullcrap, because the enemies just felt like they spammed the turning animations a lot, and they just did the turning animations at the most inopportune moments, and it could cause them to clip into enemies, they could clip into geometry, and it would cause them to skip moments where they're supposed to stand still. So the turning animations in the second Last of Us cause the enemies to be out of sync with the proper timing as to what you're supposed to do in a stealth encounter. So that was one of the main reasons why I felt that the first Last of Us did these stealth encounters a little bit better, even though these stealth encounters are a little too easy. But at the same time, it's a survival horror game, so they're going to be very easy, and I appreciate the fact that you can get most of the sections done in these games without ever having to fire your weapons. Like with the first Last of Us, you can definitely get 95% of the game done without ever having to fire your weapons. And because of this, it allows you to save up on ammunition for a lot of your weapons. Like with the bow and arrow, on this walkthrough, I don't use the bow and arrow that frequently. And because I don't use it so frequently, I'm able to save up a lot of ammunition. And even when I do decide to use arrows for my bow and arrow, I can get arrows back in the upcoming sections. So the game does offer you a lot of liberties when it comes to utilizing the weapons, and I really appreciate that about this game. Now, for the second Last of Us, I would say roughly 85% of the time, you were allowed to not use your guns, because there are a lot of moments on that game where you had to use your guns to really make the sections flow properly, because the enemies demanded a lot, seeing as how they were very complex in their designs, and they could do so much more compared to the Last of Us 1 counterparts. I mean, there were a couple of moments where this was not justified properly, and these include like with the turning animations and with moments where, you know, enemies could be very bullcrap unless you took them out. But aside from those moments, that didn't really make up that much of a percentage. So overall, that game is really well designed. And I definitely feel it's better designed compared to the first Last of Us, because the first Last of Us has some really questionable sections. And it all begins in Pittsburgh in the financial district, because there are some encounters that I honestly don't understand how QA could have missed them, because they're very buggy, and these aren't rare issues, these are consistently occurring issues that happen every single time I play this game, and I don't understand how they could have missed them. It makes no sense. I need to go into a lot of detail about these upcoming sections when I get to them, because they just border on unfinished design, and The Last of Us Part 2 didn't have any kind of sections like that. The only thing that was very broken about that game was the encounter select, because of the stupid pop-up message that would appear saying that you've completed the encounter when you actually haven't. And you could even get that message appearing when you weren't even in an encounter. It's the only time that's happened to me. It's bizarre. How the heck could they have missed something like that? And it hasn't been patched yet, and the game has been out since June 22nd. It makes no sense. Unbelievable. But this encounter here looks very intimidating, but it's very easy. Just run at the beginning, get to that cover, wait for that guy to look to the left, and then run past them. And once you get down here, there is not a lot of combat later on, and I'm just going to skip directly over to the next encounter, because there's nothing I need for these restrictions. And as I stated before in my walkthrough of the second Last of Us, when you're putting such restrictions on yourself, you're not really finding a need to explore these environments, because you mainly get crafting supplies and bricks and bottles. So you're able to just go past these sections very quickly. I mean, I didn't skip those areas because I wanted to include them as part of my no commentary version, because I have a deep amount of respect for the series, and I just feel you're missing out on a huge portion of the game if you're not going for these. But they can easily be cut out from this walkthrough, because I'm not finding any need to use them. And right now we're encountering a clicker, and that right there is the main advantage of the bricks on this game. Bricks, very useful against the infected. Bottles, very useful against humans. If you try using them in either way, you will not have equal success. Bricks are not very good against humans, because when you try to melee humans with bricks, they can somehow cancel their flinch animation after the second melee hit and just attack you. And then, if you try to use bottles on infected, it doesn't stun them that well compared to humans when it comes to the melee. And in the second Last of Us, you're not even having to worry about that because the bricks and bottles do the exact same kind of effect when you try to melee them, where they will always open up an enemy to a strike animation, and you're able to do a large amount of damage to them. And right now we're in a stealth encounter. This stealth encounter is very easy. Compared to the second Last of Us, when the runners spot you, they immediately go into a combat status, and it can be very bullcrap because the runners, they twitch around a lot and they move their heads around, and it can feel like at times they spot you for no reason, whereas with the humans, they don't move around so erratically. And in the second Last of Us, the roles are reversed. The infected don't twitch a lot, and they don't do a lot of these turning animations, whereas the humans, they do the exact same thing that the infected do, where they do a lot of these turning animations, and they move their heads around a lot, and that makes it very hard to take them out, and it can be very bullcrap, as I've already explained. So, be very careful when you're trying to stealth kill infected on this game. I'm very glad that they made it where the infected don't immediately go into a combat status in the second Last of Us. They still do the effect where they have to see you for a little bit before they start to attack you. And in the second Last of Us, the enemies had to go into a grace period animation where they get startled by your presence before they attack you. And on this game, they do that animation, but the moment they do the animation, everyone just knows where you are. It's very, very bullcrap. I'm so glad they changed that in the second Last of Us. The only problem, however, is that you cannot grab enemies from the front on Survivor difficulty in the second Last of Us. You can actually grab enemies from the front in the first Last of Us, but it only works on humans, and the conditions for doing so can be very weird with this game sometimes. And going back to what I was saying, the only way to stop an enemy from fully detecting you on Survivor difficulty whenever they're in that grace period animation in the second Last of Us is to use either a bow and arrow or the silenced machine gun, shoot them in the leg, and then grab them, because when you do that, they cannot alert other enemies during the animation, which is very helpful. You can also use the silencers on your pistol to put the enemies into that animation. I mean, I couldn't use it, of course, in my walkthrough, since I was doing the no upgrade restriction, and the silencers require you to purchase an upgrade. And I should actually talk about the upgrades right now, seeing as how we're on that topic. So, this game has the exact same kind of upgrade systems as the second Last of Us, where you have upgrades designated for your weapons and upgrades designated for your characters, but the character upgrades are very simple on this game, whereas in the Last of Us Part 2, the character upgrades are a lot more complex, and they give you a skill tree system that's tailored to specific playstyles. And it was definitely one of the cooler design choices of the game, even though most of the skills on that game are pretty useless, and they were oftentimes hindrances more so than actual help. And speaking of hindrances, we now have the Molotov, and the Molotov on this game is amazing. Molotovs will consistently set enemies on fire, they have a lot of radius to them, and you can even upgrade their radii using training manuals, which of course I'm not going for, and it actually serves as a bit of a hindrance because there's a section that you can use a Molotov for to completely skip a spawn, and because my radius isn't wide enough, I end up getting moments where the enemies don't die fully, so I'm forced to use a bomb on that section, and I'll go into further detail when I get to that part, but going back to what I was talking about with the Molotovs. Molotovs are very damaging against enemies. Every time you hit an enemy with a Molotov, they will always be set on fire, and the best part is, the fire can actually spread between enemies if they go through the fire and they touch other enemies. So you can chain the fire effect for a certain amount of time, and it's so cool that this game lets you do that. Molotovs in the second Last of Us are really bad. I don't know why they opted for the kind of design choices they went for with the Molotovs in the second Last of Us. The Molotovs are so inconsistent in their outcomes. If you hit an enemy directly with a Molotov, there are times where you can fully kill them, but then there are other moments where they get knocked back from the impact of the Molotov, and the fire is nowhere near them, and then they get their arms set on fire, and if you don't shoot them during that animation, they won't die at all. And I even get moments where enemies are fully on fire, but they're just running all over the place, and they don't die. It's just so bizarre. And I never used Molotovs whatsoever in the second Last of Us because of how useless they were. It's unbelievable that they made the kind of design choices they made. It's so stupid. So I'm very glad that this game doesn't opt for the kind of design choices that The Last of Us Part 2 went for with the Molotovs. And the fire doesn't even spread between multiple individuals. Why would they remove that feature? It's, again, another questionable design choice with the Molotovs in the second Last of Us. And because of these faults on the developers' parts, you had to throw Molotovs in a particular way by manually aiming them and aiming them in between an opponent's legs. That way they would actually receive the full fire effect. And you had to be very skillful with your throws in order to ensure that you could kill multiple enemies with one single Molotov. And it's just so technical for no reason other than because you have to do so to accommodate for faults on the developer's parts, and it's just really unacceptable that they made the Molotovs as bad as they were. And there's really no redeemable quality with the Molotovs whatsoever. And the only good thing about the Molotovs that I do like is that when you put the enemies into the stun animation where they're trying to wipe the fire off their arms or off their legs, you can grab them during that animation or finish them up with a strike animation. So that was definitely one way of accommodating for the Molotov's pathetic faults, but it just wasn't that reliable, and I never really put myself in a situation where I needed to use that. So, yeah, Molotovs, incredibly useless in the second Last of Us. First Last of Us, they're amazing, and they're definitely needed for certain situations where you're encountering large groups of enemies. You know, there are some very grueling encounters if you're not using Molotovs intelligently. And it's not just against large groups that you'll need Molotovs for. Molotovs are really helpful against bloaters, and on this game, when you hit a bloater with a Molotov, they will be fully set on fire, they will actually go into a full-on stun animation, and their health will be drained significantly, allowing you to finish them off very quickly. In the second Last of Us, Molotovs are so useless against bloaters. Bloaters will just get knocked back, they will barely take any damage, and with how inconsistent the Molotovs are when it comes to setting enemies on fire, you will most of the time never fully set the bloater on fire. I have no idea why they made this change, but why exactly do the bloaters in the second Last of Us behave differently compared to the first Last of Us? How are they any different from their Last of Us Part 1 counterparts? Why the heck should they shrug off Molotovs like it's nothing? Like, where is the incentive or the reward in using Molotov specifically for that purpose? You've saved that Molotov for the full duration to finally use it against a higher tier enemy that would actually respond to Molotovs in the first Last of Us, but then all of a sudden you throw it and they just laugh it off like it's nothing. It's so stupid. But I'm gonna have to pause on this particular tangent right now because we're coming across an encounter with a bunch of runners, and they're in combat with you, and you can get the section done melee only, but it's very difficult to do. It took me several tries, but I managed to nail it. Feel free to use your pistol here because you will get pistol ammo back later on. And you have a bunch of bricks, you have a bunch of bottles you can use to your advantage in order to get rid of the runners. And the melee against the runners is especially helpful because the runners have no kind of counterattack against you. You can just mash them down. On the second Last of Us, the runners would always get hyper armor whenever they were in any kind of attack combo, so you had to be very careful and dodge in between their strikes, and then you would be able to finish them off. I mean, the most efficient way to make sure that the enemies did not go into a hyper armor status is to go prone. They would do a single melee attack that was not a combo, you dodge, and then you just start meleeing them. You melee them 3 times, dodge, and then you melee them 3 times, and that was the best way to get rid of the runners on the second Last of Us, melee only. But this one, you're free to just mash them down, and this melee combat is not built for multiple enemies, it's built for single enemies. So you can't really use the melee effectively for dealing with multiple enemies. And it's the same case with the second Last of Us. I mean, despite the fact that you had the ability to dodge in the second Last of Us, it still wasn't very reliable against multiple enemies because of the fact that the camera zoomed in. And it's meant to represent the fact that the character is very focused on this enemy. They aren't exactly that well versed with combat. So that's why it's the way it is. And yeah, just be very careful when going for the melee. I mean, you can actually skip this whole entire encounter if you jump out the window, but I just choose to deal with it because it's a lot of fun, and I didn't want to miss out on the optional conversations for my no commentary version. And if you decide to jump out and grab the plank that will allow you to trigger the cutscene, you will be able to skip this whole entire encounter. And you'll notice right here, I'm just being very cautious with my melee. That runner, for some reason, didn't melee me. He decided to melee my partner, which was a good thing. And now I'm just going to swap between these enemies while I'm meleeing, and it works. And I was very lucky that my team was getting in there, and they were holding off the enemies. But it's not the most reliable case, because the AI on this game is very useless compared to the second Last of Us. And, I mean, the AI can do some really cool things, but they only ever do the cool things when you yourself take damage. And there are some systems that they are not allowed to do on grounded difficulty that they can do on the other difficulties. Like, Ellie can actually give you ammunition on the other difficulties, but you can't do it on grounded difficulty. And they get in your way all the time. The amount of times you try to run away and the AI is in your way and you can't get past them, it's very frustrating. And they can't even kill enemies. They're very passive when it comes to killing enemies, and they don't do a lot of damage. And I guess it's there because of the fact that your friendly AI cannot die, and Naughty Dog didn't really understand how to put in friendly AI that cannot die, but at the same time, they can kill enemies. they did this perfectly with the second Last of Us. The AI is so active when it comes to killing, and they're hardly ever a nuisance. I really love the AI on the second Last of Us. I wish they applied that kind of mentality with the friendly AI on this game, but they didn't. But wait for that guy to pass, and then you need to have a distraction here and throw it against this wall. The enemies are kind of random in their paths, so you're gonna have to make sure you throw this brick in the right spot. That way the enemies, when they go to turn towards the distraction, they won't see you. And this guy, he decides to investigate the distraction for a split second, and then he decided to go back on his neutral state of just doing turning animations. So that can be the case with certain encounters where the enemies don't fully investigate the distraction and they just instead resume what they were doing. Distractions on this game are so overpowered. Whenever you use a distraction, every single enemy will turn towards that location, but only one enemy will investigate while the other enemies stand still. This isn't the case for every single section, but this is the case for most of the sections, which is really helpful. And right now, the enemies are going off on their paths. You don't have to kill any of the enemies in here, but I still recommend you kill some of the enemies because they can be very random in what they do. Like this guy right here, I would always kill this guy just in case he decides to turn around for no reason. And right now, I'm about to get out of here. And the moment this guy moves, I'm just going to go to the right. And something you gotta bear in mind with the humans on this game, you can be fully standing and just jog towards them and they cannot hear you. This does not work in the second Last of Us. They changed that. You have to be crouched when it comes to still killing humans in the second Last of Us. Either that, or that's just a condition that's exclusive to Survivor difficulty that they decided to make a feature. But right now we're dealing with two enemies, and once you get past these two enemies, and you do some mild puzzle solving, that will conclude Boston. So I'm going to conclude the commentary here. This has been Boston in its entirety. Stay tuned for the future parts. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.